Welcome friends, welcome back to the Dirty Little Workshop. Today's project is this Industar 26M lens. It's very similar to the Industar 61s and in its construction and focal length, everything else. It's just the previous model of that from what I've been able to gather. The problem with this lens as it exists right now is that there's some buildup of old lubricant in here that has dried up, gone waxy, and it's impacting the ability to smoothly focus this. So as you turn this wheel, you can feel it. You probably can't see it on the camera, but I can feel it in there just kind of gunking up the system. It makes the focusing kind of herky and jerky, and what I want to do is pull all that stuff out, put new lube in, get this thing cleaned up and ready for use. And so let's get to it. Alright, to get started here, we have 3 screws on the back of the lens. These 3, they've got green, sometimes red paint on them, and in order to get a good grip with your screwdriver, you're going to have to clean out the slot, and that's what I'm doing here. Just kind of going over and getting any of that paint out of the slot so that the screwdriver I'm using can get in there. And they're usually not too hard. They might require a little bit of force, but once they get going, they get going. And just take your time. Don't try to force it. If they do seem a little bit stuck, put a little dab of acetone or something on the back. In fact, denatured alcohol is a little bit milder and works just as well. When you've got little teeny tiny parts like this, just have a place that you can securely put them. That way they don't roll around on your mat, get lost. And there's no reason to keep these separate. All of the screws on this, for the most part, they only go in one place. So these 3 screws on the back only go in the back. The other screws that we'll take out are generally going to be all the same with the exception of one, and I'll show you that as we get to it. The screw mount for the lens that screws into the camera and the rear flange just should pop right out. And it might require a little work because there's going to be a little gunk on them, but it just should just pop right out. And then at that point, what I like to do is just drop them into some denatured alcohol. Denatured alcohol is a very mild abrasive. It shouldn't affect any other parts of the lens. It won't affect the coating on the lens or anything. You could use isopropyl alcohol if you have that as well. But I have denatured alcohol on hand, so I tend to use it for pretty much anything like this, where I need to dissolve something that's gunky. And then we have 3 screws on the focus ring, and these usually just come right out. You have to get the right size screwdriver. It is a fairly small one. I think it's about 1/2 millimeter or so. Just get in there and pull those out. They should just come right out. There's no adhesive used. here on this ring or the next ring that we're going to do. So the screws are out, the focus ring should just slide right off the front. You may need to wiggle it a little bit just to make sure it's loose, but once it is, it'll come right off the front. And this generally doesn't need too much attention. There's not going to be any of the old lubricant on there anywhere. And then now what you're faced with is the inside of the focus ring, where you've got screws that basically capture it and prevent it from moving past minimum and infinity focus. You need to take those screws out. This top one's easy to get to. It's just right there on top, and that's what prevents the lens from moving past by impacting the rear flange on that ring. And then there's another screw that's hidden underneath that middle ring with the f-stop graduated, whatever you call that, the focus distance, and there's 3 of them. Now, of these 2 are going to be identical, and then there's another one that is longer and only goes in one place, and you'll definitely know it when you take it out because it's completely unlike the other 2 screws here or the other 3 screws that came off the focus ring. To this particular screw, this one is in between all the engraving on this ring. It's not adjacent to any of the engraving. It's typically somewhere halfway between the minimum and maximum over there on the engraving, and it comes out very, very easily. But when it comes out, you'll notice it's probably 4 to 5 times as long as the other screws, and this is because it passes all the way through that ring into the body of the lens itself and helps hold things in place. So make note of that and keep that in the back of your head when you go to reassemble this, because these 2 screws here next to the engraving are exactly identical to the screws that we took out of the focus ring, but that one screw is different. It only goes in one place. Now, moving this middle ring can sometimes be a pain. It can sometimes be a tight fit, and I'm not sure why. It's probably just tolerances within manufacturing. I've had some of these that just come loose immediately and they slide all around. This one was a little bit tight, but you don't need to move it very far. You just need to get access to this screw here. It's a tight fit, but you'll almost just need to move it like a millimeter or so to get full access to that screw. And once you do, it'll just come right out. And this screw is different from the screw that's directly above it, which impacted the flange, the rear flange on that focus ring. This one's a little bit longer. The head is longer so that it can actually stop the focus ring from moving too far past either infinity or minimum focus distance. And once you've got that off, now it's just time to clean. And what I do here is just really quickly use a Q-tip, just get some of the bigger stuff off that needs to come off. Some of this will be dried on, and abreading it with a Q-tip soaked in denatured alcohol generally removes the bulk of it. Some of this lubricant here is what looks to me, it looks newer than some of the older stuff that we'll take off. It almost looks as if someone previously tried to clean this lens, but kind of half-assed it and didn't get in there and clean everything out, which was contributing to its kind of jerky focus function. It wasn't smooth. It stuck and would jump around, and generally not usable as far as being able to focus easily or smoothly or You know, it just kind of looked like someone sort of kind of took it halfway apart and didn't really get in there and clean it up. So what I'll do here is just get a paper towel soaked in denatured alcohol and remove everything in there, even the new stuff. I don't want anything left in there. And as these Industar lenses go, the ones of this type, this one was actually kind of easy to clean because some of that stuff was new and readily dissolved. But here I take one of these fine jeweler screwdrivers and I get in there in the threads and scrape out anything that was old. You can see it's stiff, it's waxy, it's just generally not nice to have in that lens because it's going to contribute to imperfect function of the lens. And then once I've got stuff scraped out, go back over it with a paper towel and clean it up. The next step here is to clean up the focus ring. And the same thing, I'm just going to get in there with a alcohol soaked paper towel, get off, the big stuff, the stuff that's going to readily come off, and wipe it down. And actually, this works surprisingly well. The Sometimes the stuff is just so gooey it doesn't react well at all with the denatured alcohol and doesn't want to dissolve. But this particular one came out okay. Even the old stuff that didn't get scraped out by the previous owner who went in there and did a partial job of cleaning and lubricating. And the funny thing is here, I rinsed it off in the denatured alcohol and somehow managed to pick up the screw mount for the lens. It stuck itself right back in the back side of that focus ring where it'll go during reassembly, and I didn't realize it right away. Uh, so continuing on, I just continued cleaning, getting all the old gunk out, and eventually I notice it and I'm like, what the heck's this? And take it out. There you go. And there's really no secret here. You're cleaning out all the stuff. There's no magic trick. There's no special tool that you need. You just need to get in there, whether it's with paper towels, Q-tips, little screwdrivers to scrape. Uh, it's just getting in there and making sure all that stuff is out. And then as an interesting aside, the interior of these lenses tend to have a lot of sharp edges and points, and even uh, the cutouts, the mills for that focus ring, all those 90-degree angles are all really sharp. So just be careful with your fingers when you get in there. Uh, Gloves may be useful. I just don't tend to wear gloves generally when doing this type of thing unless I'm handling the actual lens elements themselves. But that's not necessary here. So just a word of caution. And then once all these are clean, basically just set them aside to dry. It's denatured alcohol, so what I'm using, it'll flash off really quick. There's no need to, stick them in a low oven or anything. Just wipe them down as best you can and set them aside for a few minutes, and that alcohol will disappear real quick. And then once you've got everything cleaned off, now it's time to put the new lubricant on. I'm using this stuff, which is just fully synthetic uh, moly grease. It's good for all kinds of applications, including this. The nice thing about it is because it's full synthetic, it's not going to really dry up over time. It's going to hold on to its viscosity, and the viscosity really seems to be perfect for lenses here. It provides a little bit of resistance, so it's not free moving, and at the same time, doesn't allow the surfaces to scrape against each other and gall up, which is important because these aluminum components here will, if they're not properly lubricated, they will gall against each other and mess up the threads, mess up all the smooth surfaces, and generally just be a pain and ruin your lens. And here as I'm applying this, and I'm trying not to apply too much, it really just doesn't take a whole lot. You don't need to gob this on, and in fact, if you do, it's going to cause problems later where that grease is going to migrate into places where you don't necessarily want it to be. At some point here, I actually do put too much on, and you'll see the ramifications of that later when I have to remove some to get a screw in. But this, just, lightly go over this, make sure it's down inside the threads, and is really just sort of an even coat. You don't want, like I said, you don't want any big chunks of this anywhere. And once you've got that lubed up, there's no need to put any on the inside of the focus ring because it's going to pick up the grease from the threads that you just put it on. So putting some grease on the focus ring itself on the inside threads will actually be too much. You just need the barest amount in there, just enough to provide the right function. So when you go to put this on, essentially what you need to do is line it up, and it's just trial and error. If you haven't marked it, here I'm just making sure that where I'm going to put that screw. Well, here's where I have to remove the grease, but where you put that screw, uh, the two screws there, you have to position it such that at minimum focus, the top screw is coming up against the rear flange on the focus ring. And then at maximum focus, when you turn it all the way back around, the lower screw comes right at the edge there of that little milled out area uh, on the focus ring and keeps it from rotating further than infinity. And that screw goes right there. The two are directly in line on the axis of the lens, and that's where it should stop, right there. So that's where you need to put your screw. And just make sure that, these are multiple lead threads, so it may take 2 or 3 tries to find the right start position for that focus ring. But once you find it, just leave it on there and put the screws in, and you'll be good to go. And that's really the most difficult part of this is just kind of positioning that focus ring. It shouldn't take too long. It only takes a couple of minutes. And one of the most fiddly parts about this is getting these screws back in. You know, they come out really easily, but putting them back in takes a steady hand and a little bit of patience. I'm actually using magnifying glasses here because these things are so small. I mean, you just look at the scale of these screws, and this is one of the bigger screws to my thumb. And, you know, it's just these things are so tiny. And here I'm actually putting this screw. I'm actually starting to put it into the wrong spot. Realize my mistake. I'm like, oh crap, that's the top one. That goes here. And it's so fiddly that I'm like, this is too much. I put it back and I move on to the one I was trying to do previous. So here, just trying to figure out the best way to do this. Sometimes the tweezers work. Sometimes you just put a glob of grease on your screwdriver to hold it in place long enough to get it in the hole. And that seems to work the best. And once those two screws are in, you can move that engraved ring, that center ring, back to where it needs to go. Here I'm just checking to make sure that one screw hole, the one with the long set screw, that's lined up with the hole in the body that it needs to go into. And I lucked out on this one a little bit, even though it was stiff, just worked it down with my fingernails and got it to the point where it needs to be. Just check with the focus ring and make sure that everything lines up. And once I'm sure that everything lines up, the first one I put in is that long set screw, and I put that right back in where it needs to be. That's the linchpin on this one. If that one doesn't go in, you've got to make sure it's lined up. But once it's lined up and that screw goes in, the other two are cakewalk. And the nice thing about this is all the rest of these little set screws, they're all the same size and they're completely interchangeable. So you don't have to keep track of which one went where or anything. All, I guess there are five of them. They all go in all the holes. So they're just little set screws, and they're just there to keep the ring from moving around and going off of register. And you can see I lost that one there. That one tried to get away. Tried to get away twice, in fact, but luckily I set up my area such that it just couldn't roll onto the floor or anything. I was able to find it easily. And these really are very fiddly. And you know, I apologize. I went out of frame there for some of these, getting them screwed in. There's really no secret. You just kind of get them started in the hole and then use a screwdriver and screw them down. Now, you don't want to get too tight here. Don't booger these down because the screws themselves are steel while the body of the lens is aluminum, and you will strip them out if you try to gorilla them in there. So here what I'm doing is I'm going to put the focus ring back on, and I've noticed that there's little marks on the inner focus ring here where those set screws were previously tightened down into the body. So all I'm doing here is lining them up with the engraving on the middle ring. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take these to extreme focus, and so I know that I know the position of the lens, and I can turn the outer focus ring to the proper engraving and get it registered right where it needs to be. So I'll line everything up, and then once I've got everything lined up, then I'll put the set screws in. But here you can see, infinity focus. It's marked right. It registers right at the right place. Double checking where the set screws go, and then once I've got it lined up, that's when I'll start putting in these screws. So here, once everything is lined up, I'll just make sure that I've got a set screw on top. I'll hold it. The position of my fingers is basically holding the focus ring right where it needs to be, and so it won't move around. And then once I've got it where it needs to be, these little set screws just screw right in. They don't protrude through the body or anything. They're just simply holding the outer ring on the inner ring. And there, I'm just confirming function. It goes from minimum focus to infinity, and everything looks good. Everything registers right on the engraving. So you can see here, this screw actually registers into the thread ring with a milled out section, sort of like a keyway. And that keyway lines up with that screw and keeps the rear from rotating out. So it's just line everything up, pop it back in. It'll go in. You might have to jigger it a little bit, but it's not a big deal. It'll pop right in, and that's all that did. There's no screws that go into this one. That just sits there. And then the rearmost flange has these three screws. These are the first screws that we took out. So we're going to put those back in. And what I found helpful is while the flange ring is off the lens, I'll just put those screws in there into the ring. And that seems to be easiest for me to get everything lined up. That way I've got, I can move this stuff about in the free air and kind of position it where it needs to be without being restricted by trying to hold the lens at the same time. And then once I've got those in there, just line them up with the holes, get them started. I don't screw them in all the way like this until everything's in. And then once I've got everything in, then I'll screw them in, tighten them down. Again, the screws are steel, the body's aluminum, so not too tight. Otherwise, you'll strip them out. And then once it's together, just kind of go over it, make sure that minimum focus distance and infinity, that everything lines up one more time. And you can see there it does. Rotate it over to minimum. Everything lines up right at 1 meter. So everything's good. The aperture rings move smoothly, and this thing's ready to go. So really just one final step here. I'm just going to take a paper towel. Any grease that may have been on my fingers when I was working on this thing that maybe got on the outside of the lens, I'm just going to go over real quick, clean everything off, give it a quick rub down, and make sure that there's nothing gooey on the outside. And I have no interest in actually taking this to the workshop and polishing it or anything. I think that would be detrimental. Number one, polishing a lens like this, you're going to get polishing compound everywhere. It's going to go into the grooves. It's going to get inside the focus ring, and those abrasives in that polishing compound can really do bad things if they start to migrate towards the inside of the lens. You just simply don't want that. So a little denatured alcohol, will get off everything that's ugly, and it'll get off any unintentional grease that may have smeared on there during the process. But the rest of it, I don't care about. If there's some 60-year-old Russian grease on the outside that's dry and it's sitting there on the surface, I really don't care. I consider that part of the patina of age. This lens is, I'm guessing, 60 years old or more. And to me, that's just the lifetime of the lens, and it's just something that comes with the package. So I have no interest in making this mirror polished at all. I think it actually takes away from the lens itself. And then what I'm going to do is just with a lens cloth, give it a light cleaning on the lenses. I know I didn't get any grease on the lenses. I was very careful, but just to remove any dust or anything that happened to get on those lens surfaces. Just really quick, just take it off. I'm not going to be uh, too anal about this. Just blow out the dust, and this thing's basically done at this point. It's back to the way that I feel it should function. So we'll stick it back on this Fed 3 camera, and this thing's going to be good to go. I'll have some other videos of me actually working on this camera because it had a couple of problems that needed to be addressed. But for now, this lens is good to go, and I think we're great. Thanks for watching, guys.